Hello, and welcome to the 42nd episode of Chorus Place. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me for today's conversation. In today's episode, I will be talking about a trip I took to Montana fairly recently, as of the recording of this episode, that is. As always, if you like what you hear, please leave a review and/or comments, follow my podcast, and tell your friends. Also, please follow the podcast page I've made on Facebook. If you'd like to contact me via email instead of a Facebook message, you can email me at corachin@mailbox.org. If you are new here, welcome. I'm your host, Cora, and I am so excited to have you on this journey with me. Today, I want to share my 2024 experience of Montana. Before I talk about that, though, I want to explain my reason for delaying the podcast's return for so long and share a quick couple of updates that I forgot to add in my last episode. The first one is that I realized you can no longer send voice messages to the podcast. I'm sorry about that. The other one is that I unfortunately don't think I can do the music you would usually hear in the episodes anymore. If the last few episodes seemed weird because of not having the music, I'm sorry. I will try to work on another option for music for the podcast episodes, but I cannot promise that I will be successful. Now, back to what I was saying before. The break from the podcast being longer wasn't completely intentional, but then it took me a little while to make the last few episodes, and I was also a little busy for a bit. I was out of town for a little while at one point after camp, which also affected when I was able to work on podcast episodes. However, I am beyond thrilled to finally get to share these memories with you, so let's just go ahead and dive into the episode. Montana was honestly so much fun, and I definitely miss being out there. We did some of the same things I've done from the other 2 times I had been out there prior to this most recent time. Most recent as of the recording of this episode, that is. However, we also did several new things too, which was super exciting and enjoyable. Some of the experiences out there from other times had new or different parts of them too, so that was a blast. I am completely ecstatic to get to share these memories with you. Before I dive fully into the Montana part of this story, I just want to very briefly explain why I was only home for 4 nights in between camp and that trip to Montana. I was only home for 4 nights because my parents, siblings, and I went to North Dakota for a family reunion of multiple generations, including my Montana family members, a few days after I returned home from camp. It was really fun. I saw a few people I hadn't seen in a long time. I also got to be reacquainted with and meet several people who I hadn't seen since I was little, I think, so I didn't really remember them because I hadn't seen them for probably several years at least. It was really nice though. We mostly hung out a lot and talked, but we also did some other fun things too. It was a lot of time in the car to get to North Dakota, but it went fine and we made it safely. The day after we arrived to North Dakota was the big reunion, so we attended that and I enjoyed it a lot. There was a lot of really delicious food there. There were Swedish meatballs, potatoes, lingonberries, and several other things. I tried at least a couple of new foods on that whole trip, including while in Montana, and I'm glad I was able to. One of the best parts of that trip, however, was getting to see family I don't really see very often. Now, let's get into the Montana part of that trip. Even though that was my 3rd time to Montana, I actually had a lot of firsts on that trip, which were a blast. It's so hard to narrow down my favorite firsts, though, because I had several that I really enjoyed a lot. My grandparents and I drove back to Montana from North Dakota, and that was new because the other 2 times I had been out there, I flew there from Illinois. The drive to Montana went very smoothly. The first day we drove back was a Monday, and we drove for most of the day from morning until evening. We did make a couple of cool stops, which was fun. It was rainy though at one point, and maybe even a little chilly as well. We had a picnic lunch at a park, which was really fun. My grandpa had a meeting he had to be on, so while my grandma and I were waiting for him to be done with his meeting, we did some rock hounding in the parking lot/driveway of the park, and I found some pretty cool rocks. I didn't end up keeping all the ones I found, but I kept a piece of petrified wood that I had found, and I thought that was pretty exciting to find that. Once we reached the town we were staying in for that night, we stopped to grab a pizza on our way to the house we stayed in that night. It was only a few more hours of driving the next day to get to my grandparents' house. The next morning, we ate breakfast, packed up, and then drove the last few hours to their house. Once we got back to the area, we unpacked, ran some errands, and that kind of thing. I enjoyed pretty much all of the things we did, but some of my absolute favorite activities my grandparents and I did together were hanging out with my two uncles and their families that live out there, going to church, driving to side by side, baking together, cooking together, listening to music, talking, getting 25-cent ice cream cones at the grocery store, going to the fair with my cousins, going to a musical, more on that later in this episode, sewing with my grandma, going to a parade, and this last one might seem a little bit odd to say, but I also enjoyed running errands with them. I think just being with them made me happy. To me, it doesn't really matter as much what we do. What matters to me is just being together. My grandpa and I also washed their truck one day as well. I enjoyed doing that. My job was rinsing the truck off with the hose after my grandpa got it all soapy. One of my favorite ways to spend at least a few of the mornings after breakfast on that trip was to go out on their front porch to do my devotions, read, and I also went through a personal retreat journal I had purchased as well. I really enjoyed the personal retreat journal a lot. Being out there is just a really nice way for me to slow down and focus more on my Bible reading. They added some comfortable chairs to their front porch, which I enjoyed sitting in while reading, doing my devotions, or even just talking with my grandparents or other relatives that live out there. I definitely spent quite a bit of time out in those chairs when the weather was nice and when I was able to. My grandparents and I did some baking and cooking together, which was super fun, and I also did some of my own too. Some of my favorite meals, or other things we made together, or that I made on my own were homemade Butterfinger bars, peanut butter cup bars, steamed broccoli, meatball subs, ribs, salt and vinegar potatoes, banana nut chocolate chip muffins. I also made a dog cake for my grandparents' dog, who celebrated a birthday while I was out there. I only tried a tiny piece of it, and it was fine. Not necessarily something I would want for myself on my birthday, but it was still fun to make it and decorate it. I really enjoyed going to church with my uncles, their families, and my grandparents. In the time I was in Montana for that trip, I went to church 3 times. That was a lot of fun. I didn't know all of the songs at every service, but I knew I think most of them. I like learning new songs in church, but I usually find it easier and more enjoyable when I already know the songs. My grandparents and I went to a parade while I was out there, and I liked that a lot. When my grandma and I did some sewing, we actually made a little snack pouch, and I put the candy I was given at the parade into it. I wasn't really expecting to get any candy at the parade, but I did get some, which I thought was actually kind of cool. One of the biggest highlights on that trip in my mind was that my grandparents and I went to a musical the night before I headed back home. That musical was absolutely amazing, and I enjoyed it so much. I probably laughed at some point during most, if not all, of the scenes. I thought the music was amazing. After I got home from that trip, I found the soundtrack on Spotify, and I like to listen to songs from that musical often. Another highlight of that trip I wanted to mention in this episode is that my grandparents and I played Rummikub in Montana most nights on that trip, which I liked a lot. It took me a little bit to figure out how to play, but I enjoyed getting to play that with them. My grandparents and I had at least a couple of good conversations on that trip. I don't necessarily remember what the specific conversations were, but I feel like I always have nice conversations with them whenever we're together like that. To close out this episode, I want to share about going back home. Having to leave Montana after having such an incredible trip was really hard. That also happened the other couple of times I had been out there prior to that. I don't enjoy leaving Montana. I think the reason I don't like it is because I'm in an environment that I love, with people that I love, and that I also know love me. The last full day that I was there was emotional at times, but the musical was a good distraction for me. The day I flew back home was a little tough too. The only ways I could keep myself from crying that day were talking, laughing, or humming. Some moments were definitely easier than others to do that, but I managed fine. I liked flying. Navigating the airports went fine, but I'm glad I had my grandparents there to help me when I needed help. I definitely gave my dad a pretty big hug when I saw him later that day. Being apart from my grandparents after being with them for I think about 2 weeks was a strange adjustment too. I had gotten used to being with them, and then it was weird when I wasn't with them after that trip. I was able to be myself more on that trip, and I also got out of my comfort zone too sometimes on that trip. What I mean by that is I did at least one thing I don't usually do much when I'm with people. I tried a few foods that were new to me, or that I hadn't eaten in a long time, and I also did some new things I hadn't done before. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please follow, leave a comment, and a review of my podcast if you haven't already, and please follow my podcast page on Facebook so you never miss an update. If you have any verses you'd like me to read on a future episode, or if you have any topics you'd like me to talk about, you can email me at corachin@mailbox.org or send me a message on my podcast page on Facebook through the link in the show notes, and I will get back to you when I can. Hope you tune in next week for the 43rd episode.